To admit, I don't know if many of you are probably familiar with the work of Stephen Brookfield, the renowned adult education writer, theorist, and activist. And I had the very good fortune when I was at the University of St. Thomas in a faculty role that my office was next door to Stephen's. And being a young first time or maybe second time in a faculty role, being able to have Stephen as a next door neighbor, particularly when we both often taught Saturday classes and were some of the only members still in the building, he would often give me some, private conversation time, and I really felt like I was quite fortunate to have that time with him. And one of the pieces that I remember from his writing as well as our conversations is he often talked about the imposter syndrome. And I'm sure many of you in your roles, whether those are in corporate roles, in leadership roles, in family roles, civic roles, or whatever, we often tend to think that imposter. And I have to admit a bit of anxiousness coming to this conversation today. And maybe it was some of my reluctance last time, Arlene, as I reflect on it and think, gee, what do I really have to share about social justice? So I have a little bit of that anxiety, but at the same rate, I've thought through this, and I thought, well, you know what, on a philosophical level, not a practical level, I serve as Dean of Business in a rather large, comprehensive, urban community college, Cincinnati State. And the mission of the community college is a societal mission. It's about providing post-secondary education to students who might not otherwise obtain it. And to me, that is a profound social justice mission. And in fact, it is a large part of why I am at Cincinnati State, not because of a dean position, not because of a business position, but it's because of the institution of a community college, and particularly Cincinnati State, because that mission of providing fair and equal access to education, particularly to underserved populations, is something that's very important to me. So on a daily basis, I'm living out, I guess, my activism of social justice. Just I do it with a dean's hat on, and I do it within an institution, but that institution is profoundly concerned with social justice. I'll share with you also, just as a lead-in, an introduction, a bit of a story of I just came from a meeting all morning talking about a new program that we're launching here at Cincinnati State. And there's a darling not-for-profit here in town who we're partnering with in Cincinnati called Cincinnati Cooks. And Cincinnati Cooks has a mission of providing culinary education to people who might not otherwise receive such education. In fact, they take people more or less off the streets and provide them with a 10-week training program. Many of them might be coming out of incarceration, might be coming off the street, coming from some difficult challenges. And in that 10 weeks, 8 hours a day, they're receiving over 300 hours of training in culinary skills. So at the end of 10 weeks, 86% of them are then employed in the food service industry. We were recently invited by the governor here in Ohio to develop a program to help people in urban settings, particularly people with diverse backgrounds, to obtain the education that would allow them to move into greater employment possibilities. Again, one of the missions of the community college. We partnered with Cincinnati Cooks, and what we're going to do is begin offering life experience credit for those 10 weeks of training they get. which is about 1/5 of the way towards an associate's degree, we'll build on that by offering a kitchen management certificate. So they will be able to move from a $7 or $8 an hour job that they presently have to maybe a 9 to 10 hour job, which is more sustainable and will give them the skills to maybe be in a supervisory role. That will then provide them a platform into an associate's degree. So it's that idea of stackable credentials, 10 weeks of job training built with a 6-month certificate program leading into an associate's degree, all the way along providing them employability. And again, when I step back from that, I see again what we're doing is living out that social justice mission that we have here at Cincinnati State of providing that post-secondary education to students who might not otherwise obtain it. In other words, fair and equal access to education. So I just offer those two things up as a starting point of sorts in terms of my who I am story and why I connect to social justice. I guess I thought originally my connection was to storytelling, but thanks to Arlene's encouragement, it's helping me think maybe a bit more interdisciplinary connection between storytelling and social justice. I use that just as a beginning point. You can see on the screen the PowerPoint presentation, which I've labeled Storytelling for Social Justice. So you've got some overview or context. There's approximately 30 slides here. The first 8 are a bit of a revisit to where we were a month or so ago, just to make sure that we have something to build on. I'll very quickly move through those. The next 10 will focus specifically on leadership and change as it relates to storytelling, sort of building a stronger platform for us to think about social justice. Because when I think about social justice, it's about change. So we'll talk about how does that relate to leadership and storytelling. And then lastly, the focus will be upon explicitly storytelling and social justice. And I'm going to introduce a model to you which I think is exquisite in terms of its simplicity, but yet its powerfulness. And I think it's something that you'll find very useful either through your academic lens and the work you're presently doing at Union, how this might help shape your research, as well as a very practical lens and how it might inform your practice. And in fact, I'll say more about it when we get to it, but that is exactly why this model between practice and theory. So I'll just take a short breath there and continue on there unless I hear any questions or concerns.
No, thank you, Nick. You can continue. It was very clear.
Okay. However, my PowerPoint isn't advancing.
Well, you'll have to tell us a story.
Let me see if there's any, here we go. I know someone in the background's looking after me, so thank you. Just again, as I said, these first few slides will sort of re-encapsulate where we've been. So for those of you who were with us on that last journey, it'll just sort of draw you back in. For those of you who weren't, you won't feel like you've missed anything, or at least you'll be able to pick up with the new material, so to say. The last time we were together, we really talked about the power of personal story, the who I am story, and why that is so critical for us as leaders, and particularly for us as leaders who feel that our gifts are to make a difference in terms of social justice. So the context that we're beginning with is personal story. I also shared with you to reveal a bias of mine, and so that you understand where I'm coming from, so to say, is a proposition that I consider to believe to be true. In other words, it shapes everything that I'm going to share with you. It may be contrary to something that you believe, so that's why I want to make it explicit up front. Very much consider myself to be a social constructionist in terms of my thinking, particularly my academic thinking. That means that I believe that organizations are a social construction. They're constructed from language. That is, we talk them into existence, as well as obviously then we talk them into changing. So creating discourse within organizations, I believe, is the central creative act of leaders. Creating discourse is the central creative act of leaders, is what I believe. So you can find books written on all types of different views and approaches and philosophies and beliefs about leadership. But what I believe is leadership is a spoken art. In other words, it's that creation of discourse within an organization is how we get things done. It's how we behave as leaders. It's how we impact organizations. Everything I say from here on out will be predicated on that belief, so I want to make that explicit. In a very practical way, and obviously this is an anecdote, but I think it's an anecdote to kind of take you from, okay, what does Nick believe philosophically, to maybe relate it to a broader context. And it's this, that Barack Obama, our 44th President of the United States, was quoted as saying, "I had to know and understand my own story," the emphasis is mine there, "before I could listen to and help other people with theirs." And I think there's something deeply profound there, that the leader of the United States, one of the largest sort of leadership roles we can probably imagine, that this individual, of all the things he has on his mind that he has to pay attention to, he understands that one of the most critical things that he can do as a leader is first and foremost understand his own story before he can help millions of people in this world who he seeks to help. That's a profound insight, a belief that indeed his own story is important. So I believe story is important. I believe it through a philosophical lens because of what I believe of social constructionism. I also see people like Barack Obama who understand it probably on a much more intuitive level. I asked two questions last time we were together. And the first question was this, a question to you of how can story be a resource for you as you go about creating community? That's explicitly a sense of belonging. It's a general question or a broad question, but asking you to be thoughtful that as academic leaders and as leaders in other contexts, if you believe story is an important resource for you as a leader, and if indeed creating community, and I'm really drawn to Peter Bloch's definition of community. He says it's our experience of belonging. Doesn't define in terms of a physical geography, but more a cultural geography, our experience of belonging. What is it then that we as leaders can do with story to be a resource as we try to develop community? And I think this has, again, explicit connections to social justice, which I'll make clear in a few moments. Last time was this. More specifically, not just how can story, but how can your story be a resource for creating community? a bit of my personal story on my learning, and thus ask you that question is, as you reflect upon your life story, that story be a resource for you. Where I concluded with you last time, my personal learning, as I reflect, was this. I think back upon my life, as I think about the writing that I do as an academic, the teaching that I do, the consulting that I do, my own leadership as a dean, one of the most profound learnings that I've had about story has been reinforced by the narrative theorists, the narrative therapists, and it quite simply can be explained as we become the stories that we tell ourselves. So it forces me to often think, what stories am I telling myself? And in turn, as I tell myself, what stories am I telling others about myself? Posing on them, what stories am I telling about others? And for me, I've come to understand that I have become a believer in the story of being a possibilitarian. And to me, that was communicated to me through my experience at the Milton Hershey School, my experience of Milton Hershey's philanthropy and servant leadership, and that belief in people being at promise and not at risk. In fact, I had a wonderful experience last Friday. If you're not familiar with Bill Strickland and the Manchester Craftsman Guild, let me encourage you at the end of this presentation to get out there and Google Bill Strickland and his work with the Manchester Craftsman Guild. I participate this year in a program called Leadership Cincinnati. It's a community leadership development program. And last weekend, we had a great learning experience with Bill Strickland. Bill, back during the 60s, when Pittsburgh was in the midst of race riots, took a very courageous position and essentially over the last almost half century has developed what I think is one of the most amazing community economic development initiatives in the world. And it's right in the heart of Pittsburgh. It includes education at a post-secondary level, but not with community college credit. It includes music and the arts. He's developed Pittsburgh's jazz scene. It includes recording studios, greenhouses, building and housing. It's an amazing holistic endeavor. And it's the spirit of this one man who's obviously empowered many others. But a few years ago, actually 13 years ago, I was in a job transition and I asked one of my mentors, I said, I want to go talk to 3 great leaders before I move into this new role. And I'm going to give myself a 3-month sabbatical to think deeply about this new role that I'm moving into. Who do I need to speak with? And I had never heard the name of Manchester Craftsman Guild or Bill Strickland. And this friend said, I'd like to do a virtual introduction, and he did. I called up Bill. I was in Hershey, Pennsylvania at the time. Bill was in Pittsburgh. And he very graciously said, come on out to Pittsburgh. He said, I'll sit down and talk with you. And one of the things he talked about is understanding people as assets and not as liabilities. Interesting thing, last week when I heard Bill Strickland speak language, for 13 years I haven't been conscious about understanding where have I developed this understanding of myself as a possibilitarian, as someone who wants to view people as at promise versus at risk. And as I sat there, I had a light bulb go off after my head, or over my head. I thought it was 13 years ago. I think I was given some language by Bill Strickland in thinking about this. So it's something just from this very week that's entered or re-entered my life. I think one of the America's most profound social justice activists, Bill Strickland, planted a seed in me 13 years ago. Bill Strickland has a book which has just been released. I'd encourage you, again, take a look at Amazon or Google it. I cannot remember the title of it offhand, but it essentially documents what he's been up to this last half century and what the Manchester Craftsmen's Guild has accomplished. It is amazing. The second thing that I've come to believe the stories that we become is this: the importance of being a servant leader. And again, I tend to look back and say, well, of course, a big seed, or maybe an initial seed for me, was that experience at Milton Hershey. But I think about the wonderful people who I've been exposed to in my life. And again, just thinking last week, Bill Strickland, an amazing example of a servant leader, of someone who serves his community. He's not seeking to move up a ladder or to achieve something for himself, but he has been 100% committed to helping leadership, or for helping the city of Pittsburgh become a better place for the people who live there. So last month when we met and began thinking about personal story, I also asked you to consider those stories that you've from others. And when you consider those stories, to ask yourself, how often do you question the validity of these stories? Because there, I think, is the seed of the work that we do in social justice. And you'll see this very explicitly when I introduce this model to you in just a bit. There's often stock stories, and in fact, this model that I'm going to share with you uses that language of stock stories. Stories that we don't necessarily think about, but we just believe to be true. And how important, particularly as social justice activists, is to be active in questioning stock stories. I'll come back to that when we look at the model, but I think it's a very critical piece that part of our activism has to be the act of questioning the validity of stock stories. The second question that I asked you is based on the fact that many of us accept implicitly on trusted sources. The question then has to be, who do we authorize to tell our story, or to tell those stories that we believe are true? This again is an important piece, because in our faith lives, trust certain faith leaders. In our family lives, we trust family members. In our societal lives, there are people in our government institutions, etc., who we've trusted tell our story. But sometimes we need to pull back and ask, can I continue to authorize those people to tell my story, or do I need to reauthorize? Do I need to rethink and reauthorize I permit to tell my story? So again, those were seeds that I planted with you last time. And if you weren't with us last time, they're seeds that I'm planting with us now. You'll see these back to life as we begin talking about the model shortly. A bit of a recap of where we were. It gives us something to stand on as we think about this next third. And before I shift into this next third, I want to just check in with you if there's any questions or concerns that I need to address before moving into this next section.
Nick, I see several questions here. And we can just take them from the top with Francis Francois. How will the continued rise in tuition affect the ability for students from urban communities to advance their education?
Is this on the chat?
Yes, it is. It's the top. Scroll up to Francis Francois. I believe that was the first question.
Oh, yes, I see.
Yeah.
Francis, this is a question that, we are, focused on daily at the community college level. I will tell you that right now, for example, at Cincinnati State, you would pay $88 a credit hour, whereas most of the other schools here in Cincinnati, you might pay about $350 a credit hour. One of the ways that we're able to fulfill social justice mission around access relates to affordability. So one of the things that we are absolutely committed to is keeping that low tuition rate, that $88 per credit hour rate. And as you can imagine, there's attention to that. You walk into the halls of Cincinnati State versus, for example, a Miami of Ohio or a Xavier, you're in two very different sort of institutions. How well cared for the facilities are, for example. So the question of very real, because you're right, and I think something you might be hinting at is even at $88 a credit hour, there's many people in this community that is still not an accessible rate. So we need to find ways, like, for example, what I was mentioning, the Cincinnati Cooks program, where in the past they would have gotten a nice pat on the back along with 10 weeks of tremendous learning. But for example, that learning wouldn't have counted for anything in terms of formal academic credit. I think as academic institutions, we need to begin partnering with our community partners in a way that can start to ask, how can we allow those people to earn credit for that invaluable learning that they're already doing, but might not be within the confines of the four walls of a formal academic institution. And we've found ways to do that, for example, in this program, where 1/5 of their associate's degree will already have been completed, but for example, will have been completed for free based on state funding that they've already received through Cincinnati Cooks. So it's a wonderful question. Tuition will continue to be the Achilles heel in terms of how do we afford people the opportunity to continue that education. I see next here, Teresa Diaz, I believe. Question of, will the continued rise in tuition cause potential students not to continue with higher ed due to the cost of paying back their loans? And isn't it twofold? Has this been considered, and how? I absolutely believe that is the case. You're right. And we see this expressed very loudly, for example, in the Occupy movement and in other less formal ways. But I think as you see people with $50,000 and $100,000 tuition loan repayments, particularly, for example, at a community college level, again, I'll give you a very real example from us, our degree in culinary education, which will cost you approximately $16,000 for your 2 years. However, there are some for-profit institutions that might charge upwards to $50,000. And one has to question, will you be able, if, for example, you need to get a loan to pay for that education, will you be able to repay a $50,000 student loan if indeed you're starting at a $20,000 a year food service? I think these aren't just economic questions, but they're also moral and ethical about how much we're charging. And Jim and James, thank you for specifying Manchester Craftsman Guild and also giving us the link. I appreciate that real-time sharing, as well as reminding me, yes, make the impossible possible, the title of Strickland's new book. And one of the last questions here, I think, Kim says, do you see stories as a tool or device for the promotion of cultural sustainability? I wouldn't get as hung up, and I don't know if you are either, with the language of tool or device, but I'd say yes, regardless of whether you call it tool, device, means. But we know that culture, one of the key determinants or shapers of culture is story. So if you want to sustain a culture, one of the best ways that a culture is sustained through story. And if you don't believe that, look at the story books, and I don't say that in a derogatory or defamatory way. I say it in a richly proud way, of those storied books of the Bible, the Quran, the Talmud, etc., that have sustained cultures for thousands of years through incredibly powerful, rich story. So yes, I think, Kim, when you ask that question, cultural sustainability is surely influenced by story. I think I've caught up on some of the stories questions there. Thank you, Constance, for drawing that to my attention. Am I good to move on to this next section?
Right ahead.
Please.
Okay. This next piece now, starting to relate this specifically to leadership and change, because in these last two sessions, the last one and this one, I want you to leave with these three questions. And the final question is this: how can story inform your understanding of change? And in fact, what I would share with you is my belief that if you think of yourself as a change agent, a social activist, a leader, the number one resource you have in creating the future that you desire for you, your community, is story. And if you want to create change, you need to change the story. Now, I say this with a little bit of academic understanding, having done some writing, research, teaching, but I think I draw also, over the last 25 years, I've worked in mining and manufacturing as a head of human resources and head of organization development, worked in the healthcare sector as a vice president of organization development. I've worked in private education as a vice president of organization effectiveness and in a dean role. And the one thing that I've come to believe, in fact, I'd say that I think I know for sure, is that consultants and others would want me to believe are necessary when seeking to do change in an organization. Some of them believe that it has to be a 100-step process that fills a 3-ring binder is necessary. And I absolutely don't believe that. I don't mean to sound too simplistic with this, but I do believe it is simpler than that. I believe it means we have to come to appreciate and understand the power of story. Because once we know what the story is, we need to change. So when you want change from a practice perspective, if you're familiar with Peter Block's work, someone who I admire deeply and tend to think of as a mentor, in fact was very central in helping me find my way to Cincinnati. He's a Cincinnatian. In fact, he calls himself a citizen of Cincinnati. If you haven't read his latest works about community in particular, it's profound stuff. What I'm going to draw you to is something that he talks about, which is the 6 conversations. And he says that in our work, leaders, particularly as change leaders, there's 6 conversations that we need to be mindful of. And again, if you want to Google this, one of the best ways to find out about this is something as called a small group. Mention around how do you create change in community. The 6 conversations that he talks about, first is invitation. And he's not talking about pretty sort of paper that we write an invitation on. How do we invite people into a conversation? So, conversations that we need to have to invite people to the table, so to say. I don't think we always think of this, because often we think, oh, let me go on my email, I'll send out this email to the 3 department chairs, I'll ask them to show up at 10 o'clock on Wednesday, and we'll work this thing out. I'm not sure that that's always the most effective invitation. Sometimes we need to think a bit more storied in how we invite people into a conversation. Second, Peter talks about the power of the possibility conversation. Because as many of you know, that old deficits-only model, entering into a conversation, that 10 o'clock Wednesday conversation with the 3 department chairs would be focused initially on what's the problem. Never invite them into the conversation of possibility. Peter reminds us the importance of that second conversation of possibility. The third that he talks about is the conversation of ownership. How do we make sure that people have a true desire to own this issue at hand that we're talking about? Only if people feel that they can own it, that they can truly make an impact, will they want to truly change. So that conversation of ownership. The last 3 is the conversation of dissent. One that I think way too often, particularly as leaders who may not be as comfortable with dissent, overlook. And we don't appreciate that if you can't say no, then your yes really has no meaning. Encourage people to be able...
Okay, I'm sorry, Nick. Would you forgive me for a minute? May I interrupt?
Yep.
Okay. Who's ever got, and I don't know who it is, I can't check. Jonathan, I'm going to have to start checking. But you've got to mute your phone. You've got to mute your speakers. What's happening is, and it's something, of course, with technology, that as Nick speaks and you type, we are hearing it. So it doesn't matter who or what. It's a matter of muting speakers, computer speakers as well as phones. It's a matter of, this is just a process, and it's very important that we can keep the trend of thought, because there's so many good thoughts going on. So we want to hear everything. So would you all be so kind as to take a check? And Nick, I'm sorry to interrupt your flow, but I want to hear the flow, and that's what's going on. Thank you very much.
The fifth is the conversation of commitment. Too often we leave that meeting not really clear on, am I committed to this change? And the last that he speaks to is the conversation of gifts. Often we tend to want to start with what's the problem, what are the deficits, versus acknowledging the gifts that abound. So I just offer that as one context of thinking about, if we want to think about leadership and story, and as social justice activists, what we can influence is changing the story. I want to share with you a specific way that I have of thinking about this that particularly I think can be helpful for you as you think about your social justice projects, or those projects in life that you tend to view through a social justice lens. And it's this, that in life there are scripts. And thank goodness there are. And if we were sitting in a room together, what I might do to show you this is, if I lifted my hand and reached out to you and we were at a cocktail party, you would probably return your hand to me. We would join them together and we would move them up and down. And you know what I'm talking about, don't you? It's the script of a handshake. Thank goodness we have that script, so that each time we meet at a cocktail party, we don't go, oh no, he extended a hand to me, what do I do? But scripts are essentially those things that allow us to understand these actions in our lives. In a storied sense, they're a sort of ordered set of expectation of what's going to happen next. And it's what allows a story to move forward. It's what provides action, momentum in a story, is the scripting. Now, if you think about this, sometimes in our lives, particularly in our social lives, particularly, even more particularly as we think about social justice, whether it's race, whether it's class, whether it's education or economics, we need to find new stories. We look at what's being played out right now in Florida, and we have to think, do we need to find a new story here with the way justice is administered in our society? We're stuck. We need a new way forward, but we can't seem to quite articulate the new script. The old script, people are upset with. Some are very comfortable with, but that's the tension of social justice. We need a re-scripting. And we're seeing that story and that re-scripting being played out right in front of our eyes on the national news, and maybe in our own lives and families right now. Now, I want to create an analog for you. If you think about when you're sick and you go to your doctor, and she will often write a prescription for you. Basically, it's some drug-based remedy for when we're ill, that drug will restore some sense of wellness to us. That's a prescription. I want to introduce you to this idea of a rescription. This idea that we might be able, in a very similar way, to use story for us when we're not doing well. So in other words, how might rescription be a sort of process transforming our old stories when they no longer serve our needs? So you, as leaders, you have a new way of thinking about how story could be the most powerful resource you have at your disposal as a social justice activist. Because what you can help your community do is change their story. You can help them with a rescription. Actually, I'm going to go back here just for one moment. I'm going to digress a little bit, and it is a bit tangential, and I apologize if you find it too tangential. But I will share with you, I do have an article on rescription. If you're interested, you can Google this. And I share it with you also because there is a bit of an interesting story behind this. That about 5 years ago, when I was working at the Banff Center as executive director, we were going through a capital campaign. And one of our large donors invited me to an investor relations workshop or retreat that he was holding in San Diego. He had put forth about a $5 million donation, and he said, Nick, I've invited a speaker I've come to know and admire, and I think that him and his partner might have interest in also supporting the Banff Center, and I'd like you to meet them. And he said, that man's name is Stedman Graham, and his girlfriend is Oprah. And I have to admit, at the time, I didn't know a lot about Stedman Graham, but I had about 3 days to do some cramming, to read all of his books and find out what I could find out. And I ended up flying down to San Diego to participate in this retreat of stakeholders in his business at which Stedman Graham was going to speak, and thinking I was going to share a wonderful dinner that evening with Stedman and Oprah. It ended up that Oprah canceled at the last minute, but I did get to spend that evening sitting next to Stedman, and I have to admit also, I'm not a real starstruck person. In fact, I don't even have a television in my home, and although I do know a bit about Stedman and Oprah. And when we sat down, I said, Stedman, I know that probably the last thing you like to do is show up to events like this and have people give you all the questions on Oprah. And I said, the good news for you tonight is that I'm pretty ignorant. I said, I don't really know much about Oprah. I said, but I'd love to get to know you. And I think he felt a great sense of relief, and we had a wonderful night of conversation. And I found out he had a profound interest in story, and in fact had an amazing story himself. And as we talked that night, one of the things that we came to was a shared appreciation for this language of rescription. And when we left the event, we said, maybe we should write an article together about this. And in fact, we did. So if you are interested, you can Google and find that article. It was written in a journal called Leadership in Action, which was published by the Center for Creative Leadership. And it's a practitioner view of rescription written by Stedman and myself. But again, a bit of a sideline, but an interesting personal story. Around leadership and change. If you're familiar with the work of Bill Bridges, he differentiates change and transition. And he says change is that which is being altered. And sometimes we don't have power or control over things that are being altered. For example, you might work in an organization that's installing a new software system. That might be a major change within that organization. But you, even as vice president of operations, may not have any impact over that change. Altered. However, regardless of your role in the organization, regardless of your perceived power, you always have to experience that change. And that is what Bill Bridges calls transition. How am I experiencing the change? What's my emotional response? So again, helping us fine-tune our thinking as social justice activists between change and transition. Transition being how I'm emotionally responding. He gives us this way of thinking or of understanding transitions. You're probably familiar with his three-tiered model of endings, new beginnings, and neutral zones. If you think about story in this context, too often, whether in a corporate context or in a social context, because you're probably much like me, or I'm much like you, that when we're charged with leading change, we tend to put a lot of emphasis on the new beginning. We tend to want to tell people about how great the new thing is, the promised land, the new beginning. When in fact, Bill Bridges says that's exactly the wrong approach. He says we need to begin by focusing on the ending, that any new beginning begins with an ending. Any new beginning must first have an ending of the old way. So we need to create space for people to talk about the endings, not the new beginnings. And only once people have had that opportunity to experience the endings and to share stories of the endings can we truly get into the new beginnings. And I think we see this played out in a very effective way with some of the work that's being done in South Africa with the Truth and Reconciliation. And as focused on new beginning as it is on ending, trying to ensure those stories about ending the old way are told and appreciated before the new stories can be explored. Again, a model as we think about change, as we fine-tune that thinking of change to transition, as we think about story and its role in change, and particularly our role as leaders in creating space for stories of endings as well as new beginnings. So as I go to conclude this section, and again, I'll stop and take a breath and look to you for questions again, which I see are surfacing. My question to you is, are you willing to ask this courageous question of yourself? To ask yourself, well, where in my life, again, whether that's your social life, your home life, your civic life, your faith life, where in my life is it clear that I'm not able to achieve my goals with the story I've got? Because maybe that's going to suggest to you something in need of a rescription, someplace where the stock story isn't working. I'm going to skip over this next one. We might come back to it a bit more detail than I think we need to move into now. Sort of springboard for you is this. As you think about social justice, narrative structure, there's only three real key pieces to story. You see them in red there: character, plot, and moral. Those are the three sort of variables that we have to work with. How do we tend to describe the characters of the story? Are they deficits? Are they label-based? Is it based on someone's color, on their gender, on their sexual orientation? How do we tend to tell the stories of the characters? Also, in terms of the plot, how do we frame the challenges? Are the challenges based on a community's weaknesses, on their strengths? Do we even see them as having choice? Or do we only see them as disempowered and voiceless? And even how we tend to make sense of moral. So again, as we move into this next section, we might revisit this, and I might ask you to sort of unpack some of your thinking around character, plot, and moral. For this last section, I'll again just do a little bit of revealing to you as I think through myself and social justice and what matters to me, and maybe thinking back to that structure that I just shared with you about the moral to the story. One of the things that preparing for this has forced me to do is to say, well, what does matter to me? In terms of social justice, what is my activism? How can I be explicit about that? And there's two things. The first is I tend to think of myself as grounded in the spiritual practices of, and in Quakerism, there's something known as minding the light. And I'm going to share with you two thoughts here. One comes from Mother Teresa, who says that the most terrible poverty in this world is not economic, but it's loneliness, the feeling of being unloved. And as I reflect on my personal story, I can see in hindsight, in retrospect, why I've been drawn into business. And I can now make sense of why I'm a little bit of that unnatural-looking businessman, because I tend to see business not solely through an economic lens, but I'm deeply concerned with poverty. But I've come to understand that the poverty that we experience in workplaces and organizations and businesses is more like what Mother Teresa says. It's a poverty of loneliness, of feeling unloved. So my social activism has something to do with restoring love in the workplace. It also has something to do, J. Brent Bill is a Quaker theologian kind of along the lines of Parker Palmer. And he says this, he says, when I learned to see others by God's light, and I hope you don't take offense to the specific reference to God, you can insert whatever might be appropriate to you there or ignore, but J. Brent Bill, being a Christian, says this. And unusual traits are probably not so different from my own. And when I reflect on that, I think, you know what? When I tend to see the light in other people, I tend to realize that they're a lot more like me, or that I'm a whole lot more like them than I think. He continues by saying, beholding them, and I think that's really powerful language for us to think about as social activists. He says, beholding them this way doesn't let me remain untouched by their lives. In other words, when I see the light in others, when I come to know their stories, when I behold their stories, I can no longer remain untouched by their lives. He says, I cross paths all day long with people filled with joys and sorrows, hopes and fears. But he says, when I take time to see the traces of God, or those traces of light in and through them, I see those things that cement our fragile bond of divine family. I think that tends to describe the sort of social activism that I'm drawn to. Activism that appreciates poverty, not as economic, but as loneliness, and our need to find love as an antidote, and our need to see the light in other people, and our shared humanity through story. Now, the second thing that I've come to realize, and very concretely, is this. There's a specific social justice activism that I'm beginning to undertake right now. You may or may not be familiar with playback theater, but playback theater is a form of improvisational storytelling. And about 15 years ago, when I lived in Columbus, Ohio, I was involved in a playback theater company. And it was one of the best times, one of the richest learnings of my life, being honored to hear others' stories and to play those back, to return to them a service of showing them their stories were honored and heard. However, for the last 15 years, I've lived in communities where I haven't been able to participate in playback. And upon moving to Cincinnati, I was still complaining about that to my wife, who reminded me, well, Nick, you proclaim to be an activist. If you want this to happen, you need to found a playback theater company. So 3 weeks ago, I went to upstate National Center for Playback Theater. I took some training with the hope that I would leave that and either know if I was courageous enough to come back to Cincinnati to found a playback theater company. And I am in the process of founding that playback theater company. And in fact, tonight, a partner organization's board is voting on whether they will approve a rehearsal space for us. Jonathan Fox was the founder of playback theater. And he said this, you can see on the screen. He said, there are many people who are not always listened to. And you know this, many of you work with very diverse populations, and all of us in our lives on a daily basis come into contact with these people. And in fact, we may in fact at time to time play these people. But he says there are many people who are not always listened to. Even more numerous are those whose stories in one way or another are too terrible for others to want. Those who have nowhere to tell their story. Our mission, and he means Playback Theater's mission, provide a space for anyone and everyone to be heard. So for me right now, I'm finding that the urgent now that I'm being called to in my social activism beyond my work in the community college is to do some work in the community with theater, with oppressed persons who don't have a place to tell their story. I want to begin creating that vessel, that space where these stories can be told. So I share that with you, again, just so that you can see how I've been reflecting, which might give you some insights to how you might be reflecting upon the power of story and how it might shape your thinking as a leader. I use that language of the urgent now. Marshall Gans, who's at the Harvard School of Public Health, talks about public narrative. Up till this point, I've been putting a lot of emphasis on the story of what I am called to do, that story of self, because we need to begin there. But that self is within a community context, what Marshall Gans calls the story of us, where we begin asking, what's the story of what my community is called to do, so that we can ultimately ask as social activists, what is the story of the urgent now? What is that urgent challenge that we are called to do now? For me, it's become crystal clear in these last 3 weeks. My urgent now is to found a playback theater company in Cincinnati. It's to become embedded in this community as a resource and a place where individuals, oppressed persons, can come to tell their stories. So my challenge for you as we move into this last section is thinking, what is your urgent now? Move on then because quite honestly, this is the piece that has excited me the most. And I wish I could claim it as mine. I can't. It's Leanne Bell. And any of you have even the slightest interest in story, go buy this book now. This was one of those books, and granted I'm a little bit of a story geek and inclined towards academic sort of reading, but this was a book I could not put down. Leanne Bell is at Columbia at Teachers College. She is a social justice activist and educator, and this is one of the most profound books you'll ever read about story and its value in social justice. It's built on very practical action research done with teachers and in a very applied way. It's also richly reinforced by theory and in fact is a bit of emergent theory that has given rise to this model. And I've tried to simplify the model into this one-page sort of projection that you see here. And what I want to do is walk through these 4 pieces with some real examples. I've already used that language of stock stories. Leanne Bell says as social justice activists, it's the starting place. Because social justice assumes social injustice. And social injustice usually begins because of our belief or acceptance of stock stories. Those stock stories, those things that are taken for granted, often are contested, though, by concealed and resistance stories. And I'll fine-tune what those mean as we go in depth. But concealed stories, those things that are maybe hidden behind smoke, that exist in the shadows, that are there as resistance but not as obvious. Whereas resistance stories, for example, things like the Occupy movement, they occupy our attention on the 6 o'clock news. We know it's resistance. And she says these things are incredibly needed. They're incredibly valued. They're incredibly important, even though we tend to want to have a negative connotation of resistance. She gives us a fresh new way of thinking about it, one that we can be very proud of as being resistors and people who seek to encourage and shape resistance, because it's in that resistance that we change the story, that an emerging or transforming story that challenges the stock story begins to take hold. That is the action or the change that story gives life to. In the center, the creating counter storytelling, that's the process that she describes. How important it is for us as social justice activists to come to understand our role as creating counter storytelling. Now, I want to go through each of these with you in a little bit more detail and give some very real examples. Stock stories. Think of them as the canned. In other words, they're stale, and we know they're stale, but they have an incredibly long shelf life. They're stories that are often told by the dominant group, whether that's a dominant race or class or gender, whatever that may mean, but they're presumed to have some normative status, things that as a society we tend to believe. Now, the example that I want to give you, because I think it cuts across a lot of isms, is that stock story of the American dream. And you all know that stock story. Essentially, it can be described as anyone who works hard enough can get ahead. And this American dream story has been with us for generations now. And it is still with us. It's probably, stock stories are one of those most public and ubiquitous forms of story that are in our mainstream institutions of society, and they support the status quo. So think about how the American dream supports the status quo. However, it's important here to also let us understand that there's something called counter stories. And those counter stories critique and challenge that presumption of universality in stock stories. Because there is a presumed universality in the American dream. Now, what I'd like you to do, because again, for some of you it may not be as obvious, but I do have about a 2.5-minute YouTube clip which is labeled American Dream. I gave you that just to kind of color or make a little bit more rich this understanding from Leanne Bell's model of stock stories. Hopefully, as you walk away from here today, you'll begin thinking, what are those stock stories in your lives? Maybe in your particular sort of thread of the overall fabric of social justice that you seem to focus on, whether it's education or class or race. What are the stock stories? I think the American dream is a somewhat obvious one for us. That's why I shared that one. Now, the second piece to this model is to say, okay, if there are stock stories out there, and you can think of these stories existing in society, in organization, in community, and in fact, that's what Leanne Bell did. She was interested in a sort of micro level of the teaching profession or field. So you could think of doing research using this as a narrative methodology of beginning to collect the stock stories and then asking, well, what are some of the concealed stories? And she says these are stories that coexist alongside stock stories, but they often remain in the shadows. So they're hidden from a mainstream view, but they provide a perspective that's often very different from that of the mainstream. And I love this language of thinking of stock stories as sanitized stories that come from the center of public life. Then concealed stories are those ones that leak out from the margins. So think of yourself as a narrative methodologist, a researcher at Union in your doctoral program. She suggests that, well, maybe some places that we go to listen for concealed stories are in church basements, front porches, pubs, etc. In other words, some of those places that we've come to know as third places or third spaces. She even says that these often offer a critique or a talkback to mainstream narratives. Now, to give you a very concrete example of this again, there's an example, and I just want to give a little bit of context. If you remember, about 3 or 4 years ago when the economy really took the initial nosedive, GM claims bankruptcy. Very quickly, they went through a major ad campaign to talk about the rebirth of GM. What I'm going to share with you next is a commercial, a sort of ad busters commercial that was created by social activists, which took the exact commercial that GM produced, but did a different overlay of language on it. In other words, they did nothing to change the visual imagery. It's still the same, but they changed the story literally. So they changed the text that went with this.
Icon.
Think of these stories exist in
To me, what the American
in organization, in community. And in fact, that's what Leanne Bell did. She was interested in a sort of micro level of the teaching profession or field. So you could think of doing research using this as a narrative methodology of beginning to collect the stock stories, and then asking, well, what are some of the concealed stories? And she says these are stories that coexist alongside stock stories, but they often remain in the shadows. So they're hidden from a mainstream view, but they provide a perspective that's often very different from that of the mainstream. And I love this language of thinking of stock stories as sanitized stories that come from the center of public life. Then concealed stories are those ones that leak out from the margins. So think of yourself as a narrative methodologist, a researcher at Union in your doctoral program. She suggests that, well, maybe some places that we go to listen for concealed stories are in church basements, front porches, pubs, etc. In other words, some of those places that we've come to know as third places or third spaces. She even says that these often offer a critique or a talkback to mainstream narratives. Now, to give you a very concrete example of this again, there's an example, and I just want to give a little bit of context. If you remember, about 3 or 4 years ago when the economy really took the initial nosedive, GM claims bankruptcy. Very quickly, they went through a major ad campaign to talk about the rebirth of GM. What I'm going to share with you next is a commercial, a sort of Adbusters commercial that was created by social activists, which took the exact commercial that GM produced, but did a different overlay of language on it. In other words, they did nothing to change the visual imagery. It's still the same, but they changed the story literally. So they changed the text that went with this. It was posted on YouTube, and quickly it went viral. So here's an example of a concealed story, and I'll say a bit more when we come back from this, but I'll ask you again now, if you would. Viral wasn't a lot, but did reach a whole lot of people. It offered a critique or a talkback to that mainstream narrative around GM's reinvention. I think a good example of a concealed story. But the third piece that Leanne Bell's model talks about is resistance stories. In other words, stories that demonstrate how people have resisted social injustices, and you name what that ism might be, and how they've challenged stock stories. And again, she points out that these resistance stories may come from concealed stories, may come from artists or educators or activists. I'm going to give you a moment here, an example of one that comes from a poet, because we know that artists are often great at shining the light or giving us window to resistance that may not often be expressed in mainstream culture. And she also reminds us that resistance, while it often has had a negative connotation, she reminds us to consider that if you think about it in terms of a healthy organism, that resistance is the ability of an organism to ward off that which is damaging. So when you think about your role as a social activist and in crafting resistance stories, it's one of the healthiest things you can do in an organization or society, because you're helping to ward off that which is damaging. And just think about now, again, right here today, the Occupy movement, a wonderful example of a resistance story, mostly to a stock story about the American dream. The Occupy movement is essentially a resistance story to the stock story of the American dream. What I'd lastly like you to do here in terms of the last of the YouTube clips Again, it's only less than a minute, and surely you've seen and listened to Maya Angelou before and her Still I Rise reading of her poem. But why don't you again go over to the links, click on that, about a minute. We'll come back after you've watched
Out of
Maya
the huts of
Angelou's
history's
reading
shame,
of Still I Rise.
I rise. Up from a past rooted in pain, I rise. A black ocean leaping and wide, welling and swelling, I bear in the tide. Leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise. Into a daybreak miraculously clear, I rise. Bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave, I am the hope and the dream of the slave. And so, I rise.
Okay,
Okay, Doc.
so trying to give you some diverse examples here, and this last one as we think about resistance stories, the poet's ability to state the truth in terms of opposition to a stock story, in this case of racial injustice, and in some ways maybe commodified by the establishment and coming to be seen as a stock story maybe in and of itself. But nevertheless, I think power in her reading and writing of this powerful resistance story. And if you look at that in that overall view of the stock stories, the counter stories, the resistance stories, what ultimately comes from that in Bell's model is the emerging or transforming stories, those new stories that deliberately get constructed to challenge the stock story, to build on and amplify the concealed and resistance stories, and create new stories that interrupt and challenge the status quo. They energize change. So if you begin to think of your role as a leader, as a social justice activist leader, you can perceive yourself as having a wonderfully rich and powerful new resource of story. But you need to be mindful. What are the stock stories? How do you breathe life into concealed stories? How do you create space for resistance stories and nurture the emergence of transforming stories? I think another great example, many of you, I'm sure, work in the realm of strengths-based work, whether it's in psychology or social work or whatever your field of practice might be. That whole movement, for example, around positive deviance, I think is a wonderful example of transforming stories. That 25 years ago, we only understood or had language to talk about deficits-based approach to community development or personal development. Today, we have a whole new vocabulary thanks to the strengths-based movement, thanks to the resistance stories of people like Jeremy Sturkin, who gave rise to the positive deviance movement, and people in the appreciative inquiry field and strengths-based psychology, who again gave us concealed and resistance stories, and today a totally transformed story about how we can view individual, group, organization, community, societal challenges is not just based on deficits. One other book in addition to Bell's and her model that I'd like to point out to you if you're not familiar with is the book called Telling Stories to Change the World. It's by Solinger, Fox, and Irani. It's a few years old now, date of 2008, publication date. And it's a very multicultural sort of look across the world and how stories have been deliberately used by social activists as a way of creating change. A very rich book. So again, if you have specific interest in storytelling, I think it's a great resource. I'll just quote one line. You can see reference there to page 258, which I think really speaks to the essence of the book and the importance of what I'm trying to share with you today. The authors say, storytelling invites both the teller and the listener to confront messy and complex realities. And I love the honesty of that statement of messy and complex realities. And to do so in a way that promotes communication and thinking about how to connect the past and the future by thinking about what to do. Because stories allow us to do that, to think about what to do, about whatever that social activist challenge is. So I want to bring us to a conclusion here, just focusing back on that model, the storytelling project model that Leanne Bell discovered as sort of emergent theory in her fieldwork with teachers in New York City. Stock stories, concealed stories, resistance stories, giving rise to emerging and transforming stories, things that bring about action and change in the social sphere. She labels that creating counter storytelling. And I just want to leave you with that hope that this is a resource for you. But what I'd like to do here is recognizing we've got about 15 minutes and I want to honor your questions and maybe look over to the chat and try to work through some of those unless I hear differently from Constance or Arlene or Jonathan.
No,